Welcome to the Monday Morning Megaphone. As always, it's me, Logan. Uh, Today we've got a loaded episode. Well, I say it's loaded. It's pretty heavy. It's some pretty heavy stuff. We're going to talk about um, Jeffrey Johnson's. Well, maybe not specifically Johnson. He did put out a response, though. We're going to talk about Edward Feser's response to Jeff Johnson's book, The Failure of Natural Theology. We're also going to talk about a little bit about how Josh Sommer interpreted Feser's response, and then we'll talk about what I feel like is some of the most damning quotes of Feser's article. Um, and I'll talk about some stuff Johnson said in his rebuttal to you know kind of keep it a little fair and balanced. Um, but I wanted to come on here and talk about that. I'm also going to talk about some recent accusations made by Dennis Swanson against John MacArthur, his former employer. I think it's his former employer. Dennis Swanson worked at the Master's Seminary, and he has come forward on the Julie Roy's podcast on the Roy's Report, and he has said that John MacArthur didn't really write his material. So we're going to address some of those accusations, talk about uh, what is accurate, what is not, what is conjecture. I'm mostly just going to go over the article that was posted in the on the Roy's Report website, and just talk about some interesting things I found in that article. And I'll share maybe a quote from Dennis Swanson from when he was on the Roy's Report podcast. So I'll be covering that. My technology is not working very well today, so if this turns out terrible, I'll just stop the stream and I'll rebroadcast an old video. So basically, what I want to start off with is uh, Feser's response to Jeff Johnson. Feser's response to Jeff Johnson's book, The Failure of Natural Theology. I wanted to cover some quotes from Feser's article. Now, Feser, why you might be watching this and wondering, okay, well, why does Feser matter? Edward Feser is a Thomist Catholic scholar. He has written a biography on Aquinas, and so he knows Aquinas inside and out. So he read Jeffrey Johnson's book, The Failure of Natural Theology, and he had a few things to say about Johnson's work. Uh, let's cover this first quote. This is how he opens the article. He says, H.L. Mencken famously defined Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. Puritans and Calvinists more generally have a reputation for harboring an ungenerous suspicion of even the most innocent delights as sinful in disguise. No kidding. Have you ever been on the Reform pub? Though this reputation is not necessarily justified, I disagree with Feser. I couldn't help thinking of Mencken's barb as I read the opening pages of Calvinist pastor Jeffrey D. Johnson's book, The Failure of Natural Theology. Now, I don't necessarily think this is a damning quote, but I do think it's a funny quote. Feser goes on to say, Johnson tells us that the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, who influenced Aquinas, didn't leave behind any writings. That will come as a surprise to the generations of students and scholars who have pored over Plotinus Enneads, which is something you can easily find on Amazon. Josh Sommer, on his program, when he covered Feser's response, he said that he just kind of looked for it casually on Amazon, and he found it for like under $40. Not to mention the publishers who have long kept this work in print. So Johnson clearly says in his book that Plotinus didn't leave behind any writings. Now, let's be fair to Johnson for just a second. Johnson responded on the Reformed Baptist blog. He responded to this accusation, and he said, okay, well, Plotinus did actually leave behind some works, but he didn't personally publish them like his students published them. It's like, okay, well, that's something you should have known before you made that statement. And so I thought that was funny. Feser also talks about a quote in Johnson's book where he quoted from the Summa Theologia. He said, purportedly quoting from the passage in the Summa Theologia, where Aquinas presents his second way of proving God's existence, Johnson attributes this argument, the claim that efficient causes do not extend ad infinitum into the past. Sorry if it sounded like I mispronounced a word there. My teeth aren't in. So I actually slipped, my gum slipped on it. Johnson attributes to this argument the claim that efficient causes do not extend ad infinitum into the past. Not only is this not what the text says, but when proving God's existence, Aquinas purposefully avoids the question of whether the series of causes extending backward into the past had a beginning. A little time with Google reveals that what Johnson presents as a passage from the Summa was not taken from any translation of that work, but instead was cut and pasted from a random source on the internet purporting to reconstruct Aquinas' reasoning. Now, whenever Josh Sommer went and did his video over this, and of course I'll link that in the show notes, go and watch Josh Sommer's treatment of this. This is part of the reason why I'm not going to spend a very long portion of this podcast talking about it, because Josh Sommer did a really good job evaluating Feser's article. But basically what I wanted to get at is the context of Johnson's writing this book. Johnson lives in Conway, Arkansas. Now, if you don't know anything about Conway, it's like the college town of all college towns. It's got 4 colleges, and now it's got his seminary there. So let's say Johnson's writing this book, and he doesn't even own a copy of the Summa. I'm sure he does own a copy of the Summa, but let's just say he doesn't. Well, Johnson can go to Hendrix, which is a Methodist college there. He can go to the library at Hendrix and check out a copy of the Summa. He can go to CBC, which is a Baptist Bible college there, and he can check out the Summa. And of course, he's got a seminary now, and I'm assuming his seminary has a library. If his seminary doesn't have a library, well, personally, that explains a lot. But I'm sure they do, and I'm sure he can get his hands on a copy of the Summa. He doesn't need to reconstruct a quote from random sources on the internet for his book. He has access to all this information, and yet he chooses to take a quote from a random source on the internet. Now, when Josh Sommer covered this treatment, he actually mentioned that I'll just give you the quote. Josh Sommer says, "We'll give Johnson the last word on this to clarify what he was doing, but it appears that this quote came from another source, not Thomas Aquinas. It came from some other source, whether it was a summary commentary on Thomas's 5 ways, specifically the second one, or whether it was a kind of restatement of the argument. It didn't directly come from Thomas Aquinas' work, even though Dr. Johnson attributes it to the Summa Theologia." So what I'm getting at here is, when I lived in Lamar, which was a small town outside of Clarksville, Arkansas, I went to Clarksville since it was just right there. And Clarksville had a PCUSA college there, and they had a enormous library. I actually went to the college, and I got a library card for the library there on campus. It was $10. And I could go in the library anytime they were open, and that's where I did a lot of my sermon prep. They had access to commentaries and resources from all different kinds of theological perspectives, and they let me check out books for weeks at a time, and I was in there all the time doing sermon prep, reading. And I I encountered works and books that I would have never been able to afford because they were rare. I encountered stuff that, you know, I couldn't have had easy access to on my own. So Johnson didn't have any excuse to quote from a random source on the internet when he's got three Bible colleges, or I'm sorry, two Christian colleges and his own seminary to draw resources from. Now, again, to be fair to Johnson, in his response on the Reformed Baptist blog, again, which is something I will link in the description, in his response in the Reformed Baptist blog, he says that this was an error on his part. Okay, kudos to him for owning up to it. It was an error on his part, and he included what the actual quote should have been. But man, if you're doing scholarly stuff, if you're writing scholarly material, you got to do scholarly stuff. Like, get the actual quotes from reliable translations of the work that you're citing, if the work you're citing is not originally in English. And it's hard, it's inconvenient, but it's got to be done. So Sommer correctly says that Sommer says that Dr. Johnson attributes this quote from the Summa when it's not. Sommer also has resources in the show notes of his show where he did this video covering Johnson's work of the four possible sources where Johnson could have gotten this quote from. So it's Josh Sommer did a 3-part review on the Failure of Natural Theology, and I think he showed very well all of the problems with it. Basically, it's a guy who's just got a bone to pick with a guy who died in the 1500s. It's what it is. I said it last week whenever I was talking about Brian Save and the stuff going on Twitter. It's like, what did these pastors do when they actually had time? Because social media takes up a lot of our time now, and a lot of these Reform guys, particular Baptists, a lot of these particular Baptist guys, they got famous on social media. Like, they got their name out there because they did nothing all day but put out straight fire tweets. And enough of the Reformed bigwigs liked it to where, they also became a Reformed bigwig. That's what happened. So I'd like to know what pastors like Jeffrey Johnson did before he had time to just dig up Aquinas from his grave and take a big old steaming poop on him. For my next topic today's not going to be very long. I'm 13 minutes in. I've already done the first half. For my next topic today, I'm going to look at John MacArthur. This situation came to my attention this week whenever I was listening to Joe Thorne's Doctrine and Devotion podcast. I don't listen to Doctrine and Devotion a whole lot. I haven't really consistently listened to it in years. Last time I consistently listened to Doctrine and Devotion was like back in 2017, 2016. Like, it's been like 5 years since I consistently listened to it. But I saw that Joe Thorne did an episode over when pastors should resign. And of course, he wasn't talking about MacArthur when he said something about pastors resigning. But that was the topic of the show. But he opened up the show making jokes about how him and Jimmy Fowler, do their own material, and how, they don't plagiarize nobody. And so when I first heard him taking shots like that, I thought he was, still talking about Ed Litton and the whole debacle with the Southern Baptist Convention. So I got a good chuckle out of it. But then he mentioned that MacArthur had been accused of plagiarism. And I thought that was odd. I'd never heard any such accusation against MacArthur up until this point. So I looked into it. I looked into it, and I found that the Roy's report had been talking about John MacArthur and the accusations of plagiarism, and it all stems from this gentleman named Dennis Swanson. Dennis Swanson actually worked for MacArthur. He worked for the library. He worked in the library of the Master's Seminary. And what I want to do at this time, I want to go over. I want to go over the article, the first article I saw on the Roy's Report website. Now, let me just qualify something here. I don't trust Julie Roy's about as far as I can throw her, unless she's citing her sources. And in this particular instance, she's citing her sources. And so that I can respect. So let's look at the article here. Former vice president at the Master's University and Seminary publicly accused John MacArthur of plagiarism in a tweet on Sunday. The accusation came in a thread poking fun at MacArthur for calling popular Bible teacher Beth Moore a narcissist while naming a study Bible after himself. I got to admit, that's pretty good. MacArthur also steals chapters from people, Dennis Swanson tweeted. Swanson is a former vice president for library accreditation and operations at the Master's Seminary and University. Or Master's University and Seminary. That's what I said, isn't it? I think so. Anyway. Swanson shared images comparing identical chapters from 2 editions of a book by MacArthur and the Thomist faculty. One edition attributed the chapter Frequently Asked Questions About Biblical Counseling to Swanson as editor. The other attributed it to MacArthur and Wayne A. Mack as editors. And what I'll do is I'll go back to my PowerPoint here, because I couldn't get it on the PDF, but I got it on the from the website, and I'm going to show you this here. So this was the initial tweet. John MacArthur is calling Beth Moore a narcissist, and then he names the Bible after himself. And this is Dennis Swanson's response to that tweet. Here's what he's showing here. He's showing the first photo on the left. If you can't see it, it's kind of blurry on my end. I don't know how well y'all can see it. But on the first photo on the left, Dennis Swanson shows this picture of this chapter called Frequently Asked Questions About Biblical Counseling, and it's in a pastoral counseling book put out by the seminary. And under the title of the chapter, it says compiled and edited by Dennis M. Swanson. Well, again, you can't see it clearly right here, but if you were to go on to Twitter and actually look this up, you would see very clearly that this is the same chapter. None of the initial text right here on the first page has been changed. And then it's listed as chapter 19 in the new volume from the picture on the right. And instead of saying compiled and edited by Dennis M. Swanson, it says John MacArthur and Wayne A. Mack. And so Dennis Swanson is showing here that MacArthur took his name off of it and replaced it with his own. Or at least that's what it appears. So there's the tweet that I couldn't get on the PDF. Okay, in follow-up tweets, Swanson explained that the first image was from a 1994 book by MacArthur, Mack, and Thomist faculty titled Introduction to Biblical Counseling. Swanson said he compiled and edited Chapter 21, Frequently Asked Questions About Biblical Counseling, without assistance from MacArthur or anyone else. He said, I crafted the questions and received original answers for each. Swanson tweeted, I did not cull answers out of existing materials. The second image, Swanson tweeted, was from How to Counsel Biblically, a 2005 reissue of the 1994 book by publisher Thomas Nelson as part of John MacArthur's Pastor's Library. Swanson explains that in the reissue, 3 chapters were removed, so the numbering was changed. The Roy's report reached out to MacArthur and Phil Johnson of Grace to You, MacArthur's broadcast ministry, for comment, but neither replied. I'll show you at the bottom where Phil Johnson actually did reply. So they did an update on this article. They said, we also reached out to Thomas Nelson, a subsidiary of HarperCollins Christian Publishing, which published both the 94 book and the subsequent reprints. A spokesperson with HarperCollins said, we take accusations of plagiarism seriously, and we are looking into the matter. And that was on February 15th. The representative confirmed that they continue to investigate the matter. So maybe there'll be some repercussions for this. Don't know. I mean, I'd kind of like, I think it'd be interesting if something did happen as a result of it. Swanson mentioned MacArthur's alleged plagiarism on the Roy's Report podcast. What's the truth about John MacArthur and his ministries? And of course, I'll include the link to that as well, which was broadcast last March. On the podcast, Swanson also alleged that MacArthur has never written a book himself, but has instead relied on ghostwriters like Phil Johnson and Nathan Busenitz. In a 2010 blog post, Johnson explained that the books he writes for MacArthur, so Johnson admits he writes books for MacArthur, derive from MacArthur's sermon transcripts. I mean, I can believe this to some extent, because you have pastors all the time who will take their latest sermon series or whatever, and they'll have it, they'll edit it down, and they'll put it into a book. Now, I'm actually in the process of doing this. Last November, I preached through Hebrews chapter 10, and so what I'm doing is I'm taking the notes of the sermons that I preached over Hebrews 10, I'm editing them down, and I'm going to publish them as a book. Now, I don't think it's wrong to do that. So if that's what's happening with MacArthur, okay, fine. He's just, reprinting his sermons. However, and of course that I'm reading here from the article, last sentence down. However, Swanson alleged that Busenitz wrote books out of whole cloth. There was no sermon series behind it. The Royce Report reached out to Busenitz for comment, but he did not reply. When it was reissued as part of the John MacArthur's Pastor's Library, my name was removed, Swanson tweeted. I had no knowledge of the change ahead of time and never received an explanation. Swanson added that he is mentioned in the reissue for answers he wrote as the bibliography compiler. Swanson also tweeted the table of contents from both books. One names Swanson as the editor of Frequently Asked Questions chapter, and the other names MacArthur and Mack. John MacArhur, a religion scholar and research fellow for the Center of Faith and Human Flourishing at the LCC International University, responded, I have edited academic journals, edited symposia, etc. This is plagiarism. It's actually worse because it's the republication of an entire chapter under someone else's name. And I didn't bother getting that tweet, but the Twitter handle is right there. It's at Jamin Humner. You can kind of see that if you need to pause the video, but it's right there. You can look that up if you want to. But these are pretty heavy accusations by Swanson against MacArthur. Now, I have my opinions about this, but I mean, when it comes to something like this, opinions don't really amount to much. What I want to know is facts. I want to know if MacArthur really did do what Swanson's claiming he did. Now, given the amount of hypocrisy that I've seen out of MacArthur and out of those conservative evangelifish guys, it wouldn't surprise me. But just because something like this wouldn't surprise me doesn't necessarily make it true. I want to know what's true. I would like to see MacArthur respond to this openly and honestly. I would like to see an honest assessment of what goes on in the process of John MacArthur writing a book. If it's just a bunch of people at the seminary compiling stuff and slapping his name on it, it's disrespectful to pastors who are out here struggling to get their first book written. It's disrespectful to pastors who are out here struggling to get their first book written, and we don't have the resources at our disposal like MacArthur has. We don't have a yes man like Phil Johnson at our beck and call to do all of our writing for us so we can slap our name on it. I just want to know the truth. And it's things like this that really get me fired up. Swanson also claimed that MacArthur did not write the commentaries in the MacArthur Study Bible, but instead various Thomist faculty did. We got different sections assigned to us, different books of the Bible, and we created notes, Swanson said on the podcast. Then Dick Mayhew would edit them and put them together. The process was supposed to be, then John carefully looked at each one, changed the wording, but that was not what I saw. I saw him appear every other week or so for the first half hour, 45 minutes in this little room where Dick had taken a little conference room where the study Bible is produced. The study Bible, in my view, was 80% Dick Mayhew taking the stuff that the seminary had created, re-editing it, and John doing something. But I mean, the idea that he looked at every single note and rechecked them all, I rather doubt that happened. So it's possible that John did look at every single note and approve it, but Swanson doesn't think it's likely. MacArthur has publicly criticized pastors who plagiarize, especially in their sermons. At a conference last year at Thomist, where MacArthur serves as chancellor, he rebuked plagiarizing pastors as lazy and incompetent and unsanctified. Yep, they are, John. Yep, they are. And I'm not going to read the rest of that. I'll just go down to the update here at the bottom of the article. According to Phil Johnson, executive director of MacArthur's broadcast ministry, Grace to You, naming MacArthur as the editor of the chapter Swanson edited was intentional in 2005, but justified. It was intentional but justified. I want to know what justifies you taking the original author's name off of an article and putting someone else's name on it. I want to know what justifies that. If I tried that in my POS courses, if I tried that in high school, if I tried that in college, it would be dishonest. It'd be called plagiarism. Now, here's the deal. Whenever they go to write a book like that, like specifically the one like they did on biblical counseling, where it's a joint effort of the members of the faculty from TMUS, right intellectual property. They're agreeing to have their articles published in this work that's going to have TMUS's name on it. So that whenever they do that, that's intellectual property. So legally, they probably could take all those articles, compile them into one volume, and slap John MacArthur's name on it. And they could probably get away with doing that legally because it's all intellectual property. But it's certainly unethical. We know as Christians that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's moral, and it doesn't mean it's ethical. And I want to know what the justification is for taking Dennis Swanson's name off of his work. Because here's the deal. Let's say Dennis Swanson had some kind of moral failure while he was working there. Now, I'm not saying he did, and I don't think he did. I don't believe he did at all. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Dennis Swanson had some sort of moral failure while he was working at the seminary. And they thought, okay, well, he's been an immoral failure. He's had this thing that he's done. So we need to remove him from his position. And we also need to, I would think at that point that they would also take his works out of circulation in the seminary and in the books that he's contributed to. But that's not even what happened here. What they've done is they've kept his material and they've put MacArthur's name on it. Johnson tweeted today, I literally have no involvement with it, but I believe chapters were written as works for hire. Contributors were paid. Chapters belong to the Master Seminary to do with as they wish. Again, this is something they can probably legally do, but it doesn't make it ethical and doesn't make it moral. Another tweet, Phil Johnson states, in my judgment, TMS had good reason to expunge Swanson's name from their projects. Johnson doesn't state what that reason is. Oh boy, I wonder what that reason is. In my judgment, TMS had good reason to expunge Swanson's name from their project. Translation: We had good reason to expunge his name, but we wanted to keep his material. That's what happened. Johnson doesn't state what that reason is, nor why TMS kept Swanson's name on a previous chapter. I have reached out to TMS to corroborate and or clarify, but no one has responded, and that's the conclusion of the article. Oh man, one other thing I wanted to get to on the on this situation here is that if you go back and you listen to the podcast that Dennis Swanson did with Julie Roys, they talk about a lot of things. They talk about the books that MacArthur allegedly did not write. They talk about the new hymn. They talk about the hymnal that Grace to You put out. Hymns. I think it's called Hymns of Grace. I'm not so sure about that, but I think it's called Hymns of Grace. And then Dennis Swanson mentioned in passing something that I was talking about last week. I was talking about the Legacy Standard Bible. If you caught last week's episode, I was talking about how Christianity Today removed the Passion Translation, or not, they didn't remove it. Christianity Today reported that Bible Gateway had removed the Passion Translation. And I was talking about how the Passion Translation is a Bible translation for like real hyper-charismatic folk. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, John MacArthur's come out with the Legacy Standard Bible. And I shared an article from Garrett O'Hara that he wrote on Things Above Us, where he said that there is a concern that the Legacy Standard Bible could become that Calvinist Dispy translation. And so Dennis Swanson kind of mentioned in passing the Legacy Standard Bible. He said in the podcast, he said, it always struck me odd, we couldn't find a hymnal we like, so we created our own. They're working on a Bible translation, the Legacy Bible. He means the Legacy Standard Bible. We don't like what we have. There's no Bibles we like, so we're going to create our own. Well, they said they have 6 people that have been working for a year to translate them out. Well, that's impossible. That's just silly. That's an old New American Standard that they're just tinkering with the wording. And if you go on the Everything Bibles group on Facebook and you join that group and you see the posts about the Legacy Standard Bible, and then if you actually go to Google and look up the Legacy Standard Bible, what you'll find is it's essentially the 95 New American Standard Bible reprinted. The 95 New American Standard Bible is like John MacArthur's favorite translation. And so he didn't care too much when the owners of the New American Standard, which I think is now Thomas Nelson, he didn't care too much for when they decided to update the New American Standard. He didn't think it needed an update. So what does he do? He decides to make the Legacy Standard Bible, which is gonna reflect a lot of the 95 NASB. He said that's the old New American Standard Bible. They're just tinkering with the wording, and that's all it is. I've seen the sample that they just put up on the webpage, and that's all it is. It's not what the King James took all those guys, 13 years to produce. The New American Standard Bible originally, I think, took 7 or 8 years of 40 people working on it. The idea that 6 people are working a year are going to create a whole new Bible translation is just absurd, and I don't see the point in it. Why do you have to create something that's already done? Well, I think I think that's the nail right there. Oh man, um, there's a lot of accusations from Dennis Swanson against MacArthur, and I thought these comments about the Legacy Standard Bible were interesting, considering what I was talking about last week. The reason the quote on the slide looks weird is because I just copy pasted it from the transcript of the podcast. Again, you can see the podcast and all the other stuff I mentioned. That's going to be in show notes later. Um, Whenever the episode drops on Monday, you'll be able to. Whenever the episode drops on the podcast feed Monday, you'll be able to go to Anchor. You'll be able to go to Apple Podcasts. I've been having trouble with putting stuff like this on in the description in YouTube, so I don't know if you'll be able to see it there yet. But I'm going to have a list of resources available if you subscribe to the podcast. Because here's what I want. Whenever I do shows like this, I want to be able to put these resources out there for you, and I want you to be able to look at the resources for yourself and decide what the truth is. Decide what's really going on, because I just want to put the information out there. And of course, in the podcast, I do give you my opinion on it, but my opinion in the long run doesn't really mean much. What I want to know is what's really going on, and if my opinion is helpful, so be it. That whenever I give my opinion on stuff like this, it's just my 2 cents. It doesn't really mean anything. But I want you to be able to have the resources so that you can look up these things, and so that you can decide for yourself what's really going on. So, guys, again, thank you for joining me on the podcast. I'm tired of doing like Christendom, I'm tired of doing like Christendom commentaries on stuff that's going on in the theology world. I may back away from doing that for a little bit, and I may have a guest on next week if I can, if I can find someone who will come on. We will, we'll just back off of some of this controversial stuff for a little bit, and we'll have some fun on the show. It's been a while, with the exception of having my wife on a couple weeks ago. It's been a while since I've just kicked back and had fun with the podcast. A lot of this is just information that I've been thinking about, and information that I encounter throughout the week, and it really, I don't have patience for Facebook, hardly. Like, I get on Facebook, don't get me wrong. I get on Facebook and post stuff, but I just don't have the patience to go on Facebook or to go on the Late Night Theology blog and just type out a whole article and just type out a whole, long diatribe about stuff like this. It's just easier for me to turn on a microphone, show you the articles I've come across, and just talk about it off the cuff. And I hope y'all like it. I hope y'all get something out of it. So, if you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, do the whole like, share, and subscribe thing. I appreciate it. And if you want to support the podcast in some way, let me know how you can support the podcast. If you want to do that, it takes funding a little bit. It takes like $25 a month for StreamYard. This equipment's not free, so I just kind of at this point, it's just a labor of it's a labor of love. Maybe labor of love is overstating it. Not that I don't love doing it, because I do, but labor of love makes it sound like I'm just pouring myself out for you guys, when in reality I'm doing it for me. As bad as that sounds, I'm doing all this just to get this off my chest, and in the process, I hope you guys get something out of this too. So, guys, thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you next week here on the Monday Morning Megaphone.